Okay, everyone, welcome to June's second Tuesday. Hot topic, part three of our matching printers, or the top three of the color problems, which part three is matching printers to one another. So essentially, um, this is a very sophisticated subject that I don't think you'll find many other places. I'm very excited to present it to you, and I'm glad you could make it to this session. As usual, before I get going too much into the content, I'm going to share what's new with ChromaChecker. I want everyone to know that we have made a YouTube channel, so please subscribe to it as well as subscribe to our LinkedIn. It'd be great to keep you up to date. There's about 35 videos on the YouTube channel right now, which is all of our second Tuesdays going back for about a year and a half, as well as other marketing seminars that we've done in the past year. So it's all really new content. We've talked last week about, or last month, about the coming packaging interface to ChromaChecker, and it's getting closer. Those of you beta testing it are real excited about it. You've given us good feedback on it. One big thing we've added here is the ability for the operator, when using Capture and any of the instruments that we support, to check variation, not only side-by-side variation, but sheet-to-sheet variation through a run, which we're going to talk a lot about today. And you'll see how important it is for an operator to know if the color is not consistent on the sheet, whether it's within a given sheet or across multiple sheets. In addition, we've added the ability to compare extended color gamut profiles. So we've always had within ChromaChecker's ICC profile inspector the ability to compare two profiles to one another. Now we've added the ability to do this with extended color gamut profiles. And this has really been handy because if you print extended color gamut, there hasn't been a reference available to aim for until recently. I've been part of the ID Alliance committee that built the ECG profile. And one of the first things we wanted to know was how close natively is this to how a printer just prints ECG? And so by taking a profile that a printer's made in ECG to the reference profile, we can see this right here, difference between two profiles. And this is the E factor, or the visual difference of how different the reference is to the actual print that the printer is doing. So you have a good indication of visually how visually close the two prints are to one another. The E factors like delta E, we're going to talk about it in today's session because it's critical to be able to quantify how two printers are printing differently from one another. This is talking about it with ECG. I'll be talking about using the same tool in Profile Inspector for CMYK to compare how close two printers are rendering in their profile condition so that you can really see the value of this. And I don't know of any other program that does this, but for ECG, it's really handy. So today is our part three of our three-part series. And the first part was not matching color on the same device between jobs, which if you don't have that managed, forget about this session, because you've got to have your device matching color within the printer itself over time before you ever start trying to match printers to one another. And then last month, we talked about matching spot colors closer. And this month, it's a much more sophisticated topic of how to match between printing devices. So our agenda today is, number one, we need to be able to define what is a color match per customer expectations. I'll never forget this example, and some of you have probably heard it, but ID Alliance sent me into this customer who was looking at G7, and they said, G7 doesn't work for us. And I said, what do you mean? And they said, it doesn't give us close enough color. I said, okay. And at that time, I used my hard copy E-factor exercise, which this sells for $99. It comes with an iPhone app that allows you to assess what any person's expectations are for a color match. And I went through it, and they came out at a 2. And I said, okay, G7 is not going to work for you. You're going to need to not only G7, but also do ICC profiles and probably device links. And they're like, well, you're with ID Alliance, you're representing ID Alliance. I'm surprised you're saying G7 isn't going to work for you. And I'm like, well, it is going to work to a degree, but it's not going to give you a 2 factor of a match. It's going to be maybe a 4 or 5. And I'm going to show you real data that proves this out in toward the end of today's session. And anyway, what we ended up doing was we ended up going through and color managing their proofer on laminate, their press on laminate, and we built just curves, and we built an ICC profile and device links. And we put all the images in line, and when all was said and done, the curves to the proof was a 5 factor, and you can see the huge difference here, and that was unacceptable to the customer being a 2. The profile to the proof was a 2.8 factor. That they said that was the best match they'd ever seen. And this was only done using ICC device links through the workflow. So in this way, your expectations are everything. How close does it have to be? And knowing your expectations, which you can do online or through our hard copy exercise, which, by the way, I'll do a special on this again for $75 for the people who attend. Just use Second Tuesday as the code when you order it. So you can really start educating people what is a color match and what levels of a color match do you have. So when we talk about a type of color match, I like to talk about 2. There's a color common appearance, which means sharing gray balance and tonality. And then there's a true color match, an absolute color match. And people get these confused, and they need to be thought of completely independently. So we're going to go through this. And how to match. Do you match your Epson to your press? Do you match your press to your Epson? No. Ideally, you match both to a reference condition. And we'll talk through why that's so important. And we'll talk about what's available for reference conditions. We actually have a seminar I did, I don't know, 8 months ago. I should have looked in a Second Tuesday. And the title of the session is What to Aim For. What should I aim my presses for? Because depending upon your type of press and your substrate and your condition, you want to choose a bullseye of a dart target that's reachable, that you can get within the rings. You don't want to be off the target itself. And that's what E-factor helps us do, is it helps us ensure that we're within a number of rings that are expected based on your color expectations. And then we'll finish with this scenario of matching. How do you go about matching the same printing device in different locations to one another? And that takes us through the whole presentation. So I'm going to start out with an industry quote from GMG from an associate of mine. His name's Darian Young. And this was a month ago, right when I was preparing for the seminar. And he said, we hear the same things again and again. Teams are spending too much time adjusting files manually, and color accuracy across multiple devices is either inexistent or very challenging. Totally agree with that. Inexistent or very challenging. It's very challenging for a couple reasons. Number one, most people don't know how to quantify the color difference between 2 prints, 2 pages. And they don't know how to quantify how close each print is hitting the given reference that you're aiming for, if you're even trying to hit a reference. So if you're not trying to hit a reference and you're just crossing your fingers that 2 prints are going to come out of the devices and they're going to match, that's called inexistence. It's not going to happen. Now, when we talk about the kind of color matches, I talked about 2. One is a common color appearance. This means you have shared tonality and gray balance. This is what we've been talking about for 20 plus years with G7 and now G7 Plus. The looks are similar. They are not identical. Hence the sample I just shared with you. Hues and overprints can vary because being just G7 compliant doesn't put any restraints on the hues of the solids and the overprints. And it beautifully accommodates virtually any printing device with any gamut, meaning no matter what substrate the print is on, you can G7 it. Any CMYK device, you can G7 it. And you use 4 one-dimensional curves. It's pretty fast and easy, especially with ChromaChecker, which is a certified G7 product, to get your devices into a shared visual appearance. And that's better than we've ever had. But now more and more people are saying, I want a color match. Color match is different than a shared visual appearance. And it never ceases to amaze me. I'll take a G7 expert and I'll say, hey, I've got 2 G7 prints here. They're both G7 compliant. Which one is more accurate to Grackle? And they'll look at me like I'm talking a foreign language. And I'm like, no, one of these is closer to Grackle and one is not. Which one's closest to Grackle? You kind of need to know that if you're trying to match 5 printers. You kind of need to know which one's most right, so you can then compare the other ones that aren't so right, especially the ones that are less right, to make them more right, to make a match, right? I mean, it just seems like basic to me. I was asking these questions back in 2005. And that's when I came upon this metric called the 95th percentile of the cumulative relative frequency. And using this metric, which is researched beginning in 2001, you can quantify visually how different prints are. And so the one with the lowest E factor to Grackle is the one that's most accurate. And the one with the highest E factor is the one that's least accurate, which needs the most work to fix it to get it in line with the others. How do you ever begin fixing color problems if you don't know the E factor of the printer? It's beyond me. You can't do it. And so when I take a look at the second type of match is a true color match, where 2 prints are visually acceptable, meaning the customer accepts them as a match. They look similar. They don't have to be identical because different people have different levels of expectations. And if you have high expectations, you might need a low E factor, like a 2 or 3. If you have normal expectations, it might be more like 4.5. And so we have both the hard copy tool that I've shared with you, as well as our online tool that allows you to go in and see what your expectations are or what your customer's expectations are. So this link here will take you to the online tool. And this is critical when you're trying to figure out color matching. Now, I pulled this off of some marketing information from ID Alliance, hyping up G7 Plus. And again, G7 and G7 Plus provides a shared visual appearance, not a color match. But if you read this blurb, you might be led to believe something else. G7 enhances the legacy of G7 methodology, which serves as a baseline numerous global standards, and it's been great. G7 has helped provide a shared visual appearance internationally, which has never been done before. Fantastic breakthrough. But it says, to provide optimal color alignment across traditional print, packaging, and new print technologies workflow for consistency across all print processes. This reaches a little more than what I think G7 does. It provides a shared visual appearance. It does not provide a match. It does not necessarily provide consistency. It provides a shared visual appearance. And I'm not attacking ID Alliance here. I'm expressing the difference between what I call aggressive marketing versus realistic results. And I've seen too many people, like with this print that I shared in the beginning, of people doing G7 and being disappointed that the color's not matching better. And I'm going to show you why and how you fix that. So we need a metric to define color difference. G7 and G7 Plus do not define color difference in terms of which G7 verified proof or print is closest to Grackle. G7 doesn't not tell you which one's most accurate. G7 doesn't tell you how different they are to one another. So this is where accuracy is critical. Accuracy is where E factor comes in. And when attempting to align printers to one another, you have to know what the accuracy is of the printer. So this session is talking about when printers do not match one another, how do we apply E-factor to figure this out? Our last two sessions, we used E-factor to define how consistent a printer was printing to itself. And we talked about how delta E and E-factor can help you with aligning spot colors. This month, we're talking about aligning printers. And by the way, anyone who has questions on the fly, please feel free to just put them in the chat and Beth will interrupt me. Now, when we're defining what is waste, it's really critical that we understand that we have to quantify color differences. So let me get my presentation back to the slide I want it on. And here's an example of, let's say, 3 different printers printed the same sample. And they all are different. Are they all acceptable? Probably not. One of them is out of line. So how do you quantify which one's out of line? This is where E-factor comes in. And E-factor allows us to define essentially a production standard, which correlates very nicely with delta E. So delta E defines the difference between any 2 colors. E-factor allows us to define the color difference between any 2 pages or images. So here you see I have some colors here, and I can define the delta E of these differences. And down below, I can define the E-factor difference between these pages. So you get to understand E-factor is right in line with delta E. Think about it as delta E for process colors. It's saying 95% of these colors are within this delta E of the image. And we've done scientific research proving that this data is extremely useful for understanding what the industry is looking for color. So in summary, for E-factor, we've pulled over 200 print buyers, and we found that anything under 3, the vast majority accepted. Anything over 8, the vast majority of people did not accept. And that 3 to 8, if your printer is printing between a 3 and 8 E-factor to, let's say, Grackle or to another print, that's where you're crossing your fingers and your toes, hoping the printer is going to accept it. Because 50% of them will not, because it'll be too much difference, and that causes waste, and that causes non-sustainability, and that causes your company to lose a lot of money. So E-factor is a key metric for defining page differences. Now, let's get on to matching color. When we're matching color, we don't want to make one printer match another printer. I remember years ago, I was helping a customer who had a ViewTech and a Mamaki. And he wanted me to dial the Mamaki into the ViewTech. And I was trying to talk him out of it to go into a intermediate reference space like Grackle. And he would not listen to me. He's like, I'm paying you, you do this. I did that. We got the Mamaki to hit the ViewTech as best as the Mamaki could. And then guess what? The ViewTech died. And he could never find another printer that printed like the ViewTech. The Mamaki was close, but it wasn't exact. So his tougher customers left him. He almost went out of business because of this. If he would have aligned his Mamaki and his ViewTech up to Grackle, if either of those printers would have died, he could have done a benchmark, which we're talking about doing a session on next month, a series on benchmarking. So you can quantify whether or not that printer is capable of hitting Grackle or whatever reference you're aiming for to the expectations that you're hoping for. And then when the printer dies, you pop in a new printer that you benchmarked to prove that it can hit that same condition, and you're good to go. So this customer had a really tough lesson here that almost cost him his business, because he tried to make one printer match another versus trying to aim it for a given reference condition. And here's a sample in ChromaChecker's ICC profile inspector, where it's showing you the gamut difference between 2 printers. And you see one printer has more green and blue, and one printer has more yellow and orange. And truly, if you want to match these 2 printers, you've got to give up all the extra color that is not common to the 2 printers, which means you'd have to, in this case, sacrifice about 25% gamut, which is a reason to maybe just stay with G7 and go with a common color appearance versus a true color match, depending upon how close your printers line up from a gamut standpoint. And knowing this in a tool like Profile Inspector helps you understand this very clearly. So this is why you don't want to match printers to one another. So what do? Ideally, you want to scientifically determine the aim point and use a targeted condition in which to define a color match, like Grackle. Grackle is part of this ISO 15339 standard, which has a number of CRPCs, characterized reference print conditions, defined, so that no matter your print process and no matter your substrate, you don't have to invent a reference that's not standard. You can use an industry standard to aim for that's relevant to your print process, and it makes your job easy. So now you have a reference condition for different substrates. And there's typically, like I said, you have coded references and uncoded references. Most everybody knows about Grackle coded and Grackle uncoded. There's CRPC 6 and CRPC 3, but there's more CRPCs. Obviously, there's numbers between 3 and 6. And here is a visual simulation of what these CRPCs look like. And I threw the RGB in here because this is also very helpful for a customer to understand that you can't reproduce RGB on a CMYK device, especially newspaper. So CRPC1 is newspaper. So you see the bright RGB that the customer sees, and then you show them the print. And by the way, these are physical prints that you can order. And they can see, oh, this is what I see on my screen. This is what, or on my HP RGB printer. But CRPC1 is what you're going to see on newsprint. And 2 is more heat set. 3 is uncoded. 4 is super calendared. 5 is swap. 6 is Grackle, and 7 is a extended version of Grackle. So in this way, these industry references, there's actually 3 and now really a 4th uncoded reference. And I'm showing 4 coded references. There's really a couple more, like with the ECG references, CRPC 10. So now we have all of these references that we can aim for. And there's a new one in here. This UV uncoded is another ID Alliance print projects group that I participated in to come up with a uncoded reference that had a larger gamut than CRPC3 to highlight the capabilities of UV inks on uncoded paper, to give those people a manageable reference to hit so that they can know whether or not they're in the bullseye range of their expectations or outside of those ranges. And when you talk about this, the first thing you should kind of ask yourself is, okay, what's the difference between these CRPCs? So we can go ahead and look and quantify using E-factor the difference between these CRPCs. So you see the difference between 1 and 2 is an E-factor of 8, 2 and 3 is 7, and so forth. So in this way, we can know how close these references are to one another. And when we were testing the UV uncoded condition, we found that it was almost a center point between CRPC3 and CRPC4. It had a significantly larger gamut than CRPC3, and it was a 5 E-factor difference, which is a pretty good difference. And so we were really confident that this was a really good reference that the industry would like, and we've gotten great feedback on it. You see, it's all on the left. 4 are all uncoded paper. So when you jump to coded, there's an E-factor of an 8, because obviously a coded paper, even super calendared, costs more, and therefore it's going to be a bigger gamut and more visual difference. So defining the accuracy of a printing device is critical. And how do you do this? As we talked about G7 color space, they don't define accuracy. Although G7 color space does use the 95th percentile delta E, for G7 color space press compliance, you only need a 5. and that's a 5 to grackle. And you'll see in a slide in a few seconds that grackles the bullseye. You could have a press that's 5 E factor in the 3 o'clock position and a press that's 5 E factor in the 9 o'clock position, and you know what's coming. It's a 10 E factor to one another, and that is not color alignment. That is not acceptable to anybody. So just because your color space doesn't mean it's acceptable. We needed to go further than that. And this is where E factor saves the day, because E factor allows us to define how close the press is to the reference and how close presses are to one another, in addition to telling us what the consistency or the variation is of the press over time. So here we have two printers, both G7, scenario I just shared with you. The proofer might be 2.3 E factor to grackle. The press might be 4.6, but they're 6.6 to one another, which is way up on the crossing the fingers point in terms of a customer accepting this level of print. So we need to be very conscious of this as a result, because again, 96% of print buyers will not accept an 8 or more. I would say it's more like 60 to 70% would not accept a 6.4. And if all your printers are rendering to grackle color space, that means they render between a 6 and 14 E factor to one another, which is not printer alignment. That you have a shared visual appearance, but you do not have a printer match. So when we take a look at not matching between printers, when we're looking at, let's say, an offset press and a digital press, and we're trying to get them to match grackle. So we try to dial them in. Now remember, a digital press and an offset press, it's going to have some variation. It's not going to be 3 every day. It could be 5 one day, it could be 6 the next, it could be 4 the next. So it's going to float in that window as long as you're maintaining all the variables, like your nip pressures and your ink stripes and your fountain solution and your temperature and humidity of your room, and your all these variables play in to how much variation is being seen on press. So let's say we've got an offset press drifting between 4 and 6, which is not unusual. We've got a digital press drifting between 3 and 5, which is not unusual. I'm going to show you examples of this a little later in the presentation. Now what we're looking at is a 7 to 11 between the printers, between a 7 E factor and an 11 E factor between the printers, which for most people is not acceptable. So we've got to do better. We've got to dial these devices in better. So after variation, because if you don't have precision, you can't get accuracy. In fact, if your variation in the print process is, let's say, a 3, the best accuracy you can get is about double that E factor variation. So it'd be a 6. And I've had customers who they had an offset press that was printing they were printing about a 6. And the within sheet variation of the sheet was about a 3. And they're like, well, we need a new curve because we need it closer. And I kept telling them a G7 curve is not going to get you closer until you fix the accuracy, which means putting in like maybe a closed loop system or a better ink preset system, a color server to reduce the volatility of the builds hitting the press. Until you do something like that, there's no sense attacking a curve. In fact, there's really no sense of even building an ICC profile for this press because the variation was so high. And they kept on trying to build a new curve. And what was funny was they use 50 actual press measurements for the curve. And of those 50 to 100 press measurements, only about 5 of them were G7. But when you averaged all 50 or all 100 of them, they were G7 because the dot gain was flipping around so much. It was bouncing so much. The press guys were not managing the dot gain like the way they should have been. And therefore, the variation was all over and they never could get the accuracy they wanted. And I kept telling them, you got to tackle the dot gain. And we actually have a course on ChromaChecker for press operators to teach them how to manage dot gain. And with our new packaging interface, we actually give them dot gain moves. And we tell them what they should be doing with the dot gain to get a better match to G7 or whatever reference you're aiming for. Now, the second big thing I want to talk about is paper. Paper is the fifth color in 4-color printing. You got to have the papers aligned. The next thing you need to do is make sure that the solids match the reference. So in a color managed condition, I want my indigo solids to be as close as I can to grackle, which means I have to contaminate the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks, because the native cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks, no matter which printer, whether it's Canon, Konica, Epson, HP, doesn't matter. They don't match grackle or 12647-2. You've got to color manage the solids to match the reference better. Now, we've all been working on a 3.5 for CMYK and a 5 for black, because that's what we promoted for grackle, color space, and targeted compliance. And through hundreds of prints, I find that gets me to about a 4 to 6 E factor to grackle or whatever aim point I'm looking for when our solids are 3.5 to 5. Now, if you reduce the tolerance for how close the solids have to be from 3.5 to 2, so your cyan has to be a 2 delta E to the reference, your RGB overprints have to be a 3 delta E to the reference. Now you can get closer match. But people go, oh, that's going to take me a lot longer on press. It's like, yes, it will take you longer. It's going to take you more make ready, which means it's going to cost you more to make a more accurate print, which you need to pass that cost on to the customer. If you're a printer and you're doing what you need to be doing, you need to be advertising to your customer that you're hitting these tight E factor numbers, because it's not free. The expertise and the time and effort, as you're going to keep learning through this presentation, is not free. So you better be highlighting and differentiating yourself to your customers that you're capable of doing better than Johnny down the street. The other key thing for managing the printer is, how are you doing it? As I talked about earlier, we can manage an HP Indigo with G7 curves. And G7 curves on an Indigo will get me about a 5 to 6 E factor to grackle. Okay, it's okay. For a lot of people, that's fine. But if I want to get to a 3, I've got to use ICC profiles. I've got to profile that Indigo, set up color conversion within the HP DFE, and set it up. And I can get my Indigo sub 3 easily every day of the week. But I'm not going to get there with curves. I need ICC profiles. And Idea Alliance has always been on this whole, curves will do everything. And they won't, guys. They won't. You need profiles when you start getting into this level of accuracy. And better yet, ICC device links that are optimized to reduce the volatility of overprints. So now, not matching between multiple devices. If you can imagine, if I've got 3, let's keep it simple, 3 different technologies of devices that I'm trying to match. All of these devices have different solids and overprints. And even if I color manage them, they're still going to be different. And papers are going to be different. So trying to find papers that match and trying to color manage the solids and overprints to match as well as I can to begin with is a huge first starting point to getting your printers aligned. Now, in this session, I'm going to go into all the steps necessary to get the same make and model printer matching between different locations. And you can read into it that there's even more steps if we go to different types of printing devices. But I could never fit that into today's session. So I'm just going to focus on matching multiple presses, same make and model, to the same printer. And I'm going to actually play off some actual history that I have with some customers in talking about this, because I've done this multiple times. So the scenario is matching same make and model printers. We want to ensure that we're using the same raw materials as much as possible. In one scenario that I'll share, one of the facilities was in Canada, and even though they got the same name and model paper stock, it had a different white point and different surface characteristics, meaning different absorption levels in terms of how the ink interacted with the paper. So we had to accommodate that. The other thing to understand is instrumentation plays into this. So I have a customer who, they were in Chicago, and they were building the profile with one instrument and they were verifying the profile with another instrument. And the two instruments saw the solid cyan on the ViewTech as a 3 delta E of difference. It was the same color patch, but the two instruments saw that solid cyan as 3 delta E different. So if you built a profile with instrument A and then you're verifying it with instrument B, your cyan's off by 3 delta E before you even do anything else. You can't do that. You've got to make sure your instruments are aligned. And this is a key thing about ChromaChecker with Instrument Inspector. It quantifies what the E factor is of your instrument to itself. Because if you've got an instrument like this is an instrument, it works. Its E factor is about a 5 to itself, as opposed to an instrument like this, which is an E factor of 0.2 to itself. All right. And then we can calculate the E factor between instruments. So I can calculate the E factor between my I1, my Exact, my Teshcon, my Konica Minolta. This all plays into color matching between multiple printing devices. An IntelliTrax, an inline measurement device, they all play in. Now, moving on, printer settings. With this one customer that had a printer of theirs at a sister company in Canada, we had to ask what the ink limits were, because if the company set their ink limits differently on the two printers, the color's not going to match. So we had to make sure the single ink limits and the total ink limits were aligned. The ICC profiling tools. Different profiling tools, like different measurement devices, like different printing devices, have different E factors in terms of how accurate they are. And ChromaChecker's ICC profile inspector tells you how accurate the profile is. It does a what's called a round trip calculation, which takes the LAB data from the measurement, runs it through the LAB to CMYK to LAB of the table in the ICC print profile, and gets LAB out, and then compares the E factor of the LAB in to LAB out. And the lower the E factor, the more accurate the profile. No profile will give you a 0 E factor. It's not possible. We don't have the math today, even with our supercomputers. But when you start seeing a E factor of a profile of 3, well, you could start assuming that either it's a really low quality profile, or perhaps measurement was done poorly. They missed some patches in the measurement. And you can't always trust any profile you're given. So you need a tool like ICC Profile Inspector to know this. And then we've got the conversion software. You see, we're only talking about the same printer, same make and model. And we have all of these variables we have to align. And in this most recent case I'm helping a customer with, they have different color servers, one in Canada and a different one in the US, and trying to align the profiles and the black point compensation and the rendering intents. Yeah, and we're not going to align the CMMs because the CMM is built into the color server. We just have to hope that the two color servers will be close enough in how they use their CMM, so that if I'm using the same profile, input and output, and the same settings, I get the same results, or within their expectation results. All right, that's the most we can hope for. So getting into details about this real scenario, we need to know that the paper, printing settings, instrumentation, ICC profiles are all lined up. Now, in this case, this customer has an expectation of a 5 E factor. So when they went through our E factor exercise, they came up with a 5 as what their match was. It's printing on an uncoated paper, and it's kind of book-based materials. Both companies already had ICC profiles built. Last thing I wanted to do was have them go back and rebuild profiles. So what I did was to see if we could leapfrog worrying about the different paper, different printer settings, different instrumentation, different M condition for the profiles. I had both companies submit their ICC profiles of how their printer, the same printer make and model, was printing in its native condition, i.e. the condition it was in when it was profiled. And I brought those profiles into ChromaChecker in Profile Inspector, and you can see the difference is a 5.29. And so essentially a 5.3 E factor. And if their expectations are a 5 and they're a 5.3 before they're color managed, hey, I'm taking that as a win. I'm not going to make anyone redo their profiles. we're close enough, because once we color manage this, ideally, and we color manage it to, let's say, Grackle uncoated, we should be able to get this down to, let's say a 3 or 4 to Grackle uncoated, and then naturally the printers will come closer together. So they'll be closer together than a 5. So instead of going through all the heartache of checking all these other settings, I just leapfrogged right to the profile. And remember, this is the profile of the printer not being color managed, just what we're using as the output profile for the printer. And by the way, as I was doing this, I also looked at the gamut volume, because the gamut volume will give you a good indication of how the printer was set up, if they had the same ink limits and so forth. And one was 158,000, one was 157,000. So 4 1,000ths together, which is, I was thrilled to see that. But again, I was more important to look at the data. Now, notice here also, one was M2 and one was M1. Okay, so one of them used an M2 condition on their instrument, one of them used an M1 condition. The paper, as you can see here, is a 9125 in one plant, and it's a 9106 in the other plant. Remember, same make, model printer, but 2 different processing plants made that same paper. One plant up in Canada, one plant in the US. The delta E on the paper is 3. Okay, I can live with that, because when all said and done, I'm okay with the M condition not matching. I'm okay with the paper not matching. The net result of the profile was within their expectations of a 5. Now, if their expectations was a 3, then we'd have to go back and start looking at some of these individual variables and start checking them. And how do you check them unless you have ChromaChecker? You can't. You got to check the instrument. You got to check the paper. You got to check the substrate, the instrument. So all these things play into it. So now, at one point during the stage, they weren't sure which profile was the right profile. Now, when I ask people to name profiles, I like to name them the device name, the substrate, and potentially the date. But the date's built in anyway. So unless you're changing your profile a lot because your device is drifting, put the date. You don't need the date. But if you do, put it on. And what I did with these guys was in ChromaChecker, and by the way, I think this is the only way I know how to do this, is to check how aligned your printer is with the profile you're using for the printer. And you can do this at any time. If you ever wonder if your profile needs to be updated, you can do this today with ChromaChecker. You can load your profile in ChromaChecker in terms of what you're aiming for. So here you see I've got HP indigo coated. And then I measure a color bar like our CC84 or the 12647-7 target, the Foger media wedge out of the printer. You measure it and you compare it against the profile. And here we see I have a 0.2, which is what I would expect with a good profile. I'm expecting a low E factor. And you see I'm using SCCA off because I don't want any adaptation due to the paper white. I want to see if the paper white that I'm printing today is aligned with the profile that I built on that paper white. And here I'm at 0.2. I'm good to go. I know my printer is accurate to the profile. Now, take a look at this one. This is the exact same printer with the same characterization data set, meaning the profile for the HP that was built in the last one was the same data that a secondary profiling program was used to build a profile. And just due to the inaccuracy of the profile, the same data to the same characterization data set is a 1 E factor versus a 0.8 E factor or a 0.2 E factor. So again, this shows that if you care about a color match, you need to care what is the quality of your profiling program that you're using. And we've gotten so blasé about profiling programs that people haven't really gone out and said, hey, my profile is more accurate, and prove it with this E factor metric that tells you what the round trip calculation is. So just wanted to throw another key thing here about profile accuracy is a big aspect, especially when you're trying to align printers. Now, when we're talking about variation E factor, so let's say I print 2 prints and they're off. Why are they off? Well, number one is consistency of the printing device. And there's multiple reasons for that. Go back to April's session to learn about how to track that and fix that. The quality of the ICC profile, like I just showed, will play into the high E factor of the printer. The E factor of the substrate plays in, because even the same substrate can have different color and different coatings, which causes the inconsistent absorption. And then the only way I know to check all these things is using the tools that are built into ChromaChecker, because we built ChromaChecker to accommodate printers like this printer that said 5 is not acceptable to me. I need to live in the 2 to 3 range because my customers demand that of me. So we built these tools in ChromaChecker for this type of customer, so they can live within that tight level of expectation. Now, the color server, the color conversion settings is another huge variable in terms of this whole thing. Like in one customer I was recently working with, they weren't using the Grackle uncoated profile. They were using the Grackle uncoated profile at 260 tack that someone had edited. Well, the other facility wasn't using the Grackle uncoated 260 tack profile. They were using the regular Grackle uncoated profile. So does that make a difference? Well, I brought the Grackle uncoated 260 tack into ChromaChecker profile inspector, compared it to the Grackle uncoated profile, and they were like a 0.9 difference. So yeah, there's an error there, and this error stacks. We call it E factor or delta E stack. So all these differences add on. So hey, you need everyone printing on this printer needs to use the same input profile. Even if it's off by 0.9, you need to be using the same input profile. And then you have to check the workflow settings. Honoring embedded profiles, what's the rendering intent, what's the black point compensation. The CMM you can't do much about. You just have to cross your fingers that it's going to work. The output profile you should have already checked through that process that I shared with you. In fact, I had a situation once where I had a printer that had 6 Balturos in all different places in the country that they were trying to match. And we built profiles for them remotely. And then we compared the profiles before we ever implemented the color conversion. So we built the profile. I brought the 6 profiles into ChromaChecker, and 5 of the profiles were within like 0.5 E factor of one another. One was out. And I could tell that the settings on that one Balturo were not set up right. So I could go to the tech who was running it, and I tried to explain, okay, you need this many passes, you need this much laydown, you need this much total area coverage. And they were not listening to me, or they didn't know how to change the printer. And they kept on making a profile. And before I even put the profile into the workflow, I said, no, this is wrong. You have to change the settings on the printer. And it was getting really frustrating. But oh my goodness, if I would have taken their profile as gospel and put them in the workflow and started running color, and the joint campaign that was going on would have been rejected because this one printer was way out of line, that would have been a nightmare. Being able to compare these ICC profiles was just fantastic. Now, one thing I want to focus on for a second in this RIP color settings, the perfect rendering intent for doing a color match between multiple printers is not absolute color metric, because absolute color metric will match the white point and throw down a scum dot on the print to simulate how this printer is printing a darker white point. As you saw, one was a 90, one was a 93. It would darken the 93 down to a 90, and you'd see a scum dot on the print, which you don't want. But you don't necessarily want relative color metric either. Ideally, you need a hybrid color metric and different where it's absolute without the white point. There's no industry standard on how this is invoked within the color server. It's kind of like people's special sauce. GMG has their own hybrid color metric. Allwyn has their own hybrid color metric. They're designed to kind of do the same thing, but they don't necessarily do the same thing because there is no standard on this. But again, this is part of the challenge when you're trying to match multiple printers in multiple locations. It becomes much easier if you do use the same server or the same RIP between different printers. Now, once printers are dialed in, so once I've got the profile set up, once I've got the reasonable reference, now I can see how close my printer is hitting my reference. Here's a real life scenario with two color presses. One's a 4.6 E factor to Grackle uncoded. One's a 5.3 E factor to Grackle uncoded. Remember this example, the customer's expectations were a 5. So in this case, I'm passing both of these. We're individually looking at the paper because paper's that 5th color and 4-color printing, and they're both a 1 and 1.1. So when you import the data into ChromaChecker, you get this information. How close are you to the reference? Fantastic. That's important. Now, I should also know how consistent the printer is over time. And this is real screenshot data from these two presses. Notice the press on the left, the E factor started out at about a 4, and then it started climbing to a 5. And so in February, it was a 4. In March, it was a 5. In April, it started going to a 6. And it started going up even 7 up in June. So this printer should have been reprofiled. The other printer, look at how stable it is. Now, this could have been due to temperature and humidity, which ChromaChecker tracks to make sure that's in line. But the printer on the right, even though they finally did reprofile it and they got it back into line, there was a huge period of time there where these two printers were not matching. And they were not matching because the printer had drifted and the variation of the printer was too high. And in ChromaChecker, we can compare up to 7 print conditions by when you're in Print Inspector, you click on the checkbox between your two printers and then you say compare tracks. And when I say compare tracks, it shows me that once these two printers are color managed. So yeah, they're both about 5 E factor to Grackle uncoded, but when they're color managed to Grackle uncoded, their E factor comes to a 2.2. So the green bullseye represents Grackle uncoded. The purple one on the left is 4.7 E factor from Grackle. The blue one, ColorPress 2, is 5.3 E factor to Grackle, but to one another, they're 2.2. Oh my goodness, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for an alignment of 2.2 is under 3, so 95% of all customers will accept this. I've got money-making deal because I've got my color dialed in. And if this were not this number, you notice the screen here where it says E factor and primaries and spots and overprints. You can click on these different tabs and it will tell you what the delta E's are for the primaries and spots and overprints and summary and highlight and G7 grays. So you can see why these two printers aren't the same. Is it because the primaries aren't the same? Is it because the overprints aren't the same? So this becomes an invaluable tool. This comparison becomes an invaluable tool to help you understand why your printers aren't aligned. And guess what, guys? Everyone in this seminar, there's a link coming up. You'll be able to click on that link and load your own data and get this comparison. Not only see how close your printer is printing to Grackle, but see how close your proofer is hitting your press. So we're getting there quickly. Here's another great comparison. This is comparing the two printers, but instead of comparing tracks in the lower left-hand corner, I'm comparing timeline. So when I compare the timeline, I could see that ColorPress 2 kind of went on a walkabout for a couple months there where its E factor was up in the 8+ range and way above 6 for a long period of time, where the ColorPress 1 was pretty stable. Now, again, talking about different printers have different capabilities. If I add an Epson to this graph, notice an Epson is far more precise and far more accurate. It's down in a sub-2 level if it's maintained properly and monitored properly, because every printer moves. You can see here, we see this Epson's moving. And so imagine being able to take all your presses over time and understand which printers are the most accurate, which ones are the least accurate, which ones are the closest to one another. This allows you to plan how you do your work, which jobs can be shared on the Indigo versus the iGen. Hint, high E factor jobs can be shared between the Indigo and iGen because the colorants between those two printers, even color managed, is not very close. So you don't typically want to share jobs on an Indigo and an iGen. But an Indigo and a KM1 press, they're much more in line. So depending upon your E factor expectation, you can do that. So you can imagine if we were to now talk about additional variables of different printings and colorants, the number of variables go up significantly, and this becomes much more challenging. So in summary, you define a reference that your printers can match for the given substrates, and then you set about matching color to one another. Now, there's a lot of detail I didn't go into. I shared this. You do this with Print Inspector, you do this with Instrument Inspector, you do this with Profile Inspector. I made up a checklist for our customers because some of this is just too valuable. And I had a lot of people tell me, Dave, this is the special sauce in ChromaChecker, which makes ChromaChecker way different than anything else on the market, and why it should cost a lot more than we actually charge for it. But for customers, within the next couple months, no, within the month, I will have a checklist for you of all the things you need to check if you're trying to dial printers into one another, not only if they're within the same print make model, but different printer makes and models, because there's a lot of things here and it's not easy. And I'm building a checklist so you can follow ChromaChecker and plug them in and get these printers aligned, because ChromaChecker is checking every variable, and E factor is the only metric that quantifies all these variables: the amount of variation, the amount of drift, how accurate a printer is to reference, the profile quality, the color conversion, and so forth. Now, here's your call to action, guys. I'm going to quit out of this presentation. This link allows you to use any measurement data you have, as long as it's CGATs, SVF, CXF, any of these formats should work. If it doesn't, email me and we'll get it to work. So the way this works is you drag and drop your files into this. So I'm clicking here and I'm going to sort my data. And by the way, these are all press data from customers that I've G7'd over the last year or so. And it's just CGATS data that you would submit to ID Alliance. I'm allowed 5. Okay, it's free. So let's take 5. And I'm opening this data up, and it's automatically showing me that all of these are G7 compliant. This line here shows me they're all G7 compliant. And this shows me the E factor. So this press data, Steve, this is yours, 2.2 E factor. That's phenomenal. 3.7, that's awesome. 3.9, awesome. 7.1, 4, that's great. Now let's take you can take 5 at a time, but you can still add more data. So here comes another data set in here, and that one's 3.9. So now I have phenomenal matches. The 7.1, not so phenomenal. It's still G7, but not so phenomenal. But now let's do this. Let's compare these to one another. And now when I say compare, it shows me the E factor differences between the presses. So here's a 4, 6, 5, 7, 7, 3.4, 4.7, 5.7, 5.9, 7.4, 8.3. You see what I'm saying? 9.5. These are all G7 presses. Are they aligned? No, they are not. You need E factor to align them. Now, a couple of these, you'll see they have exclamation points on. If I click on the exclamation point, it says, hey, the difference between the substrates is greater than 2. It's 3.6. To get a better press match, use the same substrate on both devices. If not possible, use the best match function in Substrate Inspector to find a closely matching substrate. That's a function in our Substrate Inspector, so you can find a substrate for your Indigo that better matches your offset press, so you can better align your Indigo with the offset press, because paper is at 5th color and 4 color printing, and you want it to match. And then I mentioned that we can look at the primaries and spots, and here we see how close are the primaries aligned. This one, 3.5, 3.7, 2.5, and typically the closer they're aligned, the closer the E factor, but not always. the overprint's aligned. So this is a phenomenal tool that you guys can use and upload your proof data to. So I can go out and I can upload proof data. So let's take this proof data, upload it. How close is your press matching your proof? You know, ideally, ID Alliance should make this part of a requirement for G7 qualification. They don't today, but let's compare this press and this proof that came from the same shop. Look at this, 12 E factor, and yet they're G7 qualified. But the reason is the substrate between the press and the proof is 12 delta E. So yeah, there's no doubt the press and the proof look miles apart because the substrate's so different. So these are all things that play in to aligning your presses and making your colors match. This link on this last slide of the presentation allows you to do this. And coming soon, this plays into our color accuracy server. We're providing a color accuracy server to the industry because we've had so many brand companies come to us and say, hey, we want to know who's using ChromaChecker because we know they're going to meet our expectations. This does it for us. This allows you to enter, if you're a printer using ChromaChecker, go into the printer sales registry and register your printers. And any brand customer that logs into ChromaChecker will have the ability to see how close printers are printing to Grackle and to one another so that they can choose who does their work based on this level of quality that they require. And in this way, this general server, right now we do it right within ChromaChecker, but our goal is to make it available to the industry so that people can upload data to the server, see that, oh, ABC litho here is printing routinely a 3 E factor, XYZ litho is doing a 6. Now, for some customers, 6 might be fine. And I'll pay for a 6. Other customers, I need a 3. And you better bet your bottom dollar that you're going to pay more for the 3 than you are the 6. So this is a way that we're encouraging the industry to get on board with E factor, understand color difference, and minimize that color difference. Bring your presses together. Align your presses to meet your customer expectations, which gives you more uptime, more profitability, less waste, less customer rejections, more sustainability. There's no reason not to do it. One ChromaChecker, 750, if you buy for 5 printers, it's $750 a year. If you save $100 of waste on one printer, you just paid for your ChromaChecker for the year. I can't get over how printers don't have a quality mindset and understand that this thing makes you money. It doesn't cost you money, it makes you money. It aligns your color expectations across every operator, every salesperson, every printing device, every customer. It will save you so much money in the long run. And if you want to be known as a quality printer with high sustainability, you have to get ChromaChecker. David Zwang wrote an article and he said, if you're a printer, especially in packaging, I don't know how you do work without ChromaChecker. So I hope you take this opportunity to hit this free link and really see how it works with your files. And we're actually building some wizards. So this will be a way that you can actually start populating your data into ChromaChecker so you can build out your ChromaChecker account from 1 or 2 printers and extend it as many as you want. We've got printers with over 2,000 printing devices on ChromaChecker monitoring these printers every day. There's no limit. And if you care about color, this is what you're going to do. So I really appreciate your time. I know I went a little over today. I hope this was worthwhile. It was a very hot topic. I'm thinking next month, we're probably going to get into benchmarking your printers so you can start understanding how to quantify how precise and accurate your printers are. And better yet, do it before you buy the printer. Holy cow. I see people buy printers all the time that end up not doing what they want it to do, especially used presses and things like that. This will be a series you won't want to miss because you will learn how to quantify your printers before you ever buy the printer. And in this way, be much farther ahead when you start trying to align printers to one another and getting management to understand you as the color person need to be involved in these decisions to help align printers. Because like I said, if someone goes off and gets best deal on a Xerox iGen one day and a Indigo the next day, you have an impossible task trying to match those to, let's say, a 3E factor. That's not going to happen. So anyway, more for next time. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and thanks for attending.